Welcome, everyone. My name is Hayden Brown, and I'm the Digital Program Coordinator for Hardy Plant Society. I want to thank you all for joining us for our final Zoom program of 2021. We've had an amazing year hosting over 15 different speakers from around the world. And while, of course, we've all missed seeing everyone in person, there's no doubt that we've been able to host some incredible speakers via Zoom. I remember in one program we did this summer, there were 3 different speakers on the program and they were all from 3 different countries, which makes for some fun time zone juggling, but it's just a sign of how the world is changing post-COVID and we're all adapting to that. And we've been able to do some really great things despite all the challenges. As a reminder, our annual meeting is coming up on November 7th, and it's free for all Hardy Plant Society members. And during the meeting, we'll hear some updates from our president, Barb, and we'll elect new board members, and then we'll finish the meeting with a wonderful presentation from our guest speaker, Jimmy Blake from Ireland. So I'd recommend that you can all go register for that right now for free at hardyplantsociety.org. Now let's get to tonight's presentation from Donald Olson. Feel free to ask questions throughout the program using Zoom's Q&A feature or in the chat, and I'll keep track of them for our Q&A at the end. Donald Olson is a playwright, novelist, and travel and garden writer. He became a pioneer in the field of garden tourism with his 2 books, The Pacific Northwest Garden Tour and The California Garden Tour, both published by Timber Press. He's the author of 7 novels and a collection of short stories, and he's written dozens of guidebooks to destinations in England, Europe, and the US, including Oregon. Donald divides his time between Portland and New York City, and in tonight's presentation, he'll give us a tour of the unique garden he has created in Manhattan over the past 4 decades. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, Donald. And with that, I'll hand it over to you. So let's get your video started.
And here I am. Thank you, Hayden. And thank you, Hardy Plant Society, for asking me to speak this evening. And thank you to all of the gardeners and my fellow gardeners and garden lovers out there. This is my first webinar, but I'm going to perform right now a magic trick. I'm going to make myself disappear right in front of your eyes, but you will hear my disembodied voice. And then I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint presentation so that we can all see it and get started. Well, hello again, and welcome to my Gotham garden. I'm not in New York actually right now. I'm doing this presentation from Portland, but I've put together some photographs and illustrations that will help me to explain how I created my New York garden over the past 4 decades, and some of the many challenges, shall we say, of creating it. When I left Portland in December 1980 and moved to Manhattan, I assumed that my days as a gardener were over and that my fingers would never again touch soil. I was moving from the mild Portland climate that we love to a different hardiness zone and a vastly different urban environment where backyard gardens were almost non-existent, certainly uncommon. Most of you probably know that New York is one of the most densely populated cities in the country with over 8 million residents. Here's a Google Earth shot of Manhattan. And if you look at the label, sort of towards the top there, that says Museum of the City of New York, where I live is right above the E in New York. And you can see the Hudson River and New Jersey to the west there, and the East River, surprisingly, to the east. New York has what I would call, I don't know if we can call any climate anything anymore, but I guess I would call it a mid-Atlantic maritime climate. Which sounds kind of nice, but what it means basically is that we have winters that can be numbingly cold with massive blizzards and howling winds, and summers that can be brutally hot and oppressively humid with howling winds, and torrential rainstorms common year-round. And between the hurricanes, the floods, the blizzards, we do manage to have some very nice days now and then. Now, my first challenge, of course, was trying to find an affordable place to live. It's a challenge for anyone moving anywhere nowadays. So I huffed my way up to fifth floor walk-ups, and I peered into dim studios with windows that looked out into really dark air shafts, and there was nothing. And if there was, there were 100 people there ahead of me, trying to find this, get the same apartment. Well, finally, kind of in desperation, I called a rental agent who said, yes, a one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side had just become available. So I dropped everything and ran over there. And the apartment was on the first floor at the back of a five-story building that was built as a private townhouse in 1898 and then converted into 10 apartments, like all the buildings around it actually, sometime in the 1930s, possibly the early 40s. The apartment I was shown was dark and, yes, dingy, and it didn't really look very promising until the agent swung open a security door at the back of the bedroom and said, "And you'd have the garden too." Well, I couldn't believe my eyes. There, just outside the bedroom door, I saw a bare plot of earth surrounded by crooked, kind of rotting stockade fencing and overhung by two giant ailanthus trees. But I knew instantly that this would be my new New York home. I signed the lease that very afternoon, and I'm still signing that lease every 2 years when it comes up for renewal. This overhead shot shows you how this Upper West Side block is laid out. Now, my building is right in the middle of the block. It's bounded by Broadway on the east, busy Broadway, but not Times Square Broadway, and West End Avenue, which is commercial free, on the west. Now, along Broadway and West End Avenue, there are larger, almost colossal, 6 to 10 story co-op apartment buildings. And then between them are those townhouses that I just showed you, all of which were built with a garden in back. And Riverside Park is 1.5 blocks to the west along the Hudson River, and Central Park is 3 long blocks to the east. Now here's a closer view that shows you the layout of the gardens in the center of the block. It's rather like an open air terrarium, I guess. And the strange thing is that the gardens at the back of my block are all entered from the first floor, but the gardens on the block behind me are all entered from the ground floor. So there's a 1-story difference in height. And when I moved in January 1980, none of these back gardens was being used. Every single one of them was derelict. Let's start with the what I started with here, if I can find where I am. So let's start with the basics that I started with. Here's a plan of the outdoor space behind my apartment. You can see a door in the bedroom opens out to this space. The total outdoor area is about 520 square feet. The actual plot of earth is about 20 feet by 17 feet, or 340 square feet. Now, that may not sound like a lot to Portland and Northwest gardeners, but it is larger than many New York apartments. And all of the brick walls at the back of my building, which I saw every time I stepped outside, had been painted with a black bituminous roof paint. It was so depressing that to this day, I can't even begin to describe the overall effect of it. But covering brick walls with this black tarry glop was a favorite tactic of landlords back then who didn't want to maintain their old brick walls of their buildings. So much of gardening is trial and error, as you know, as I know, as we all know, of course. And plants have come and gone, of course, over the years in my garden, but I did have some initial goals that I wanted to achieve. Now, one thing I would like you to keep in mind here, one very important thing, is that this is a rental garden. I do not own this property, I lease it. But I always knew that just having a space for a garden in Manhattan was such a special blessing that I wanted to make it as beautiful as I possibly could within the many limitations that I had. Um, but these were my initial basic goals. I wanted perennials only. I wanted native plants that could naturalize. I wanted plants that were suitable for shady conditions. They had to be. I wanted tough, hardy, drought resistant, unfussy growers. I wanted a variety of leaf shapes, colors, and textures. I wanted flowering trees and shrubs for height. I wanted architectural elements as focal points. The plants had to be affordable and schleppable on public transportation. I wanted plants that would give year round interest, and I wanted all of this in 340 square feet. Well, in the beginning, there was no garden at all. There was just a forlorn patch of packed down dirt. I wouldn't even call it soil. And before I could get anything to grow, I had to aerate and enrich it. Now, I didn't have a car and I really didn't have money, but I did have some big garbage bags. And I took those garbage bags over to Riverside Park, which you see here, and I collected bags of fallen leaves to work into the hard packed dirt. And then in January, when New Yorkers throw out their incredibly expensive Christmas trees, many of which come from Oregon, or used to, the city grinds them all up and leaves big piles of mulch around. So I'd go around and I'd collect bags of that as well. I'd have to pick out the tinsel, of course. And if I was with someone with a car, oh boy, I'd always ask them, beg them to stop at nurseries along the way, wherever I was, wherever we were, so I could buy a bag or two of mulch or compost. That was a real thrill back then. And I kept working and adding to the soil for years until now it's really quite rich and it's well drained. And I do not use any chemicals of any kind. Enriching the soil was one issue, sunlight was another. The garden has a southern exposure, but only in midsummer does the sun shine directly overhead for about 3 hours. Otherwise, it seems to always be coming in at oblique angles. And on top of that, the giant ailanthus trees on either side of the garden, not in my garden, but on either side of it, created very deep shade. So I had to accept the fact that what I had or wanted to have or would have would be a shade or woodland garden. And I just had to deal with that reality. The ailanthus trees are gone now, thank God. But for 20 plus years, I lived with them hanging over my garden. Now, Ailanthus altissima is sometimes called tree of heaven. Oh, how poetic. But it's more appropriately called stinking sumac because it smells awful in the spring. When it rains down millions of tiny, hard yellow flower buds, and it's like walking on yellow ball bearings. It was introduced to New York in 1820 as a shade ornamental, if they'd only known. And it's now invasive throughout the Northeast. And just as a footnote, if you know that novel or the film, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, yes, it was an ailanthus tree that was growing in Brooklyn. Why wouldn't it? It grows everywhere else. Okay, well, the Christmas ferns that you see at the bottom of this photo were some of the very first plants. They're now about 40 years old. I like them because they stay green even in the winter. I guess we call that evergreen. And this fern is native throughout Eastern North America. And typically it grows to about, I'd say a foot tall in my garden. Now, this trillium is another plant that's been coming back for about 35 years. It's not like the pretty little white trilliums that we see growing in Forest Park every spring. This trillium is called Sweet Betsy. And Sweet Betsy is not to be confused with Stinking William, which is another trillium native to the Adirondacks, which also has a reddish flower. This one is also called Toadshade, I guess because of its speckled leaves. And it has this interesting mahogany colored flower in the spring. Well, anyone who has to garden in the shade quickly learns two words: and I'm sure you know what they are: fern and hosta. And some very simple hostas were given to me by a friend from her garden, and they have been coming up now with these delicate flowers for about 40 years. I've divided the original plants many times. They grow well wherever I put them. I really like this plant a lot. I love spring bulbs. I suspect you do too. And over the years, I've tried all of them. I've tried tulips. I've tried daffodils. I've tried crocus. I've tried hyacinth. I never had any luck with any of them until finally I tried these giant snowdrops, galanthus, and they really took off. In fact, I've had to divide them several times so they don't completely take over this corner of the garden. This giant yellow crown imperial Fritillaria lutea, is another old friend who returns to say hello every spring. Hello, Fritillaria. It's about 40 years old too, and it grows to about 2.5 feet and has these beautiful, bright yellow flowers that are such a welcome sight after a long gray New York winter. But one of the first plants that I put in as a ground cover was, yes, you guessed it, Pachysandra. But I'm not going to show you a photo of Pachysandra because it is one of the most boring ground covers on earth. But one of the other first ground covers I put in was this variegated Solomon seal, Polygonatum variegatum. Pardon my Latin, it's not my native tongue. But this is a beautiful plant, and it spreads pretty rapidly, and I've had to dig a lot of it up over the years. But it has these lovely pendant flowers uh, pretty early in the spring. And I also have giant Solomon seal, Polygonatum biflora. This one really is a giant. It grows to about 3 feet tall with pairs of white flowers along the stalk. And at one point, I just decided I was going to see what happened if I didn't interfere in the garden, if you can imagine such a thing, to see what would happen. And what happened was that these two kinds of Solomon seal just ran rampant and threatened to take over everything. So I had to, unfortunately, pull a lot of them up. Now, in 1982, my spouse, Gary, was awarded a fellowship in architecture at the American Academy in Rome. And the 6 wonderful months that we spent there entirely transformed my sense of color and my vision of what our New York garden could be. So Gary's an architect. He drew up this fantasy version of our garden. Now, needless to say, uh, this grand, some might say grandiose scheme never came to fruition. I don't think I've ever seen a cypress tree growing in Manhattan. Maybe you have, but I haven't. But it did spur me on to try to create a New York version of an Italianate garden, and that was a real challenge. But the plan began to take shape when I went outside one morning and saw that the stockade fencing on the east side of my garden had been entirely removed, and there were 2 workmen on scaffolding stuccoing the brick over the brick on the building next door. And they had hundreds of concrete blocks that they were going to use to build a concrete wall around that garden next door. Well, I sidled over. I asked them if they could possibly build a wall around my garden too, and then possibly stucco it. And they said, yes, they could do that after hours and off the books, of course, this being New York. But it turned out they were both expert wall builders and stuccoers from Greece. And the super for my building said I could go ahead and have this new garden wall built, but I'd have to pay for it myself, which I did by taking some of the most ridiculous temp jobs I've ever had in my life. But anyway, so within a week, that ratty old stockade fencing was gone, and I had a new, smoothly stuccoed wall around my garden. I can't begin to tell you how thrilling this transformation was. It really was. But the walls were gray, and after Rome, I craved sunny colors in gray old New York. So I found some outdoor paint that was a shade of terracotta, and I painted the stucco walls. And then I painted one story of those awful black walls of my building. And this color I found is great because it fills the entire garden space with a kind of earthy glow, and the plants look really good against it. Now, if you've ever been in an Italian courtyard or garden, you've probably noticed that uh, the walls have ancient architectural fragments embedded in them. And the same thing is true in my Gotham garden, except that the fragments aren't ancient, they're just old. But what happened was that sometime in about, I would say, 1985, a huge piece of cornice cracked off a building on West End Avenue, crashed down to the sidewalk, and killed a passerby. Luckily, it was not me. And in typical New York fashion, building owners, they didn't bother to repair these beautiful ornamental cornices and pediments on their buildings. They just had them hacked off and thrown into dumpsters. And I used to pass these dumpsters on West End Avenue, which is lined with colossal pre-war apartment buildings. And I'd see all of these beautiful architectural fragments just tossed inside. And I couldn't bear the thought of them being destroyed. So I began to collect them and bring them back to the garden. And Gary figured out a way to embed or attach some of these fragments to the stucco walls. And I think they add a huge amount of character and interest to what would otherwise be, just a bare wall. This is another one, fleur de lis pattern. And this little puto or angel head is really my favorite. I plucked him or it out of a dumpster, and he's become a kind of icon and guardian spirit of the garden. And every time I step outside and see this little smiling face with its cracked off nose, it just brightens my day. Well, my New York garden is small, but I wanted to create different focal points within it to add to the interest. But as I said, I really didn't have much money, so I really had to take what I could find, and also I found a lot of things that were just being tossed out, and I added those to the garden as well. Now, this bird bath, which you've seen before, and believe me, you're going to see it again, is a prominent visual plays a prominent visual role in the garden. I found it on where did I find it? I found it on an abandoned estate in upstate New York, and I lugged it back to the city. The stone bird I found at a flea market, and the real bird is an eastern blue jay. Came to visit one day. This is another bird bath. This one's very low to the ground so that it acts as a kind of reflecting pool. And sometimes sparrows and doves like to come and splash around in it. And then in the summer, dragonflies like to hover around the surface. I found this 100-year-old cast iron lamppost on Central Park West about to be thrown away. And don't ask me how, because to this day, I don't know how we managed to lift and carry this sucker 3 long blocks and into the garden, because it must weigh, I'm not kidding you, at least 250, if not 300 pounds. And it used to stand upright in the garden, but lately we've had all of these, windstorms and so on. So for safety's sake, I now just lean it kind of picturesquely, jauntily against the wall there, and I will probably paint it at some point. This piece of decorative wrought iron used to be inset into the front door of my building. And when they modernized the lobby a few years ago, they replaced the rather beautiful old wooden doors with glass doors, and they were going to throw this away. So of course I asked if I could have it, and they said sure. They lugged it into the garden. It's been there ever since. It's like a wrought iron memory of the building as I first knew it. And by the way, you see the wall behind it. Well, people sometimes comment on the intricacy of that patterning, and they ask, how on earth I did it. I mean, it must have taken forever. It must have taken as long as Michelangelo took to paint the Sistine Chapel. Well, I do hate to burst bubbles, but I didn't do a thing. That's the brick wall that was covered with that bituminous black paint, and I painted over it. And then one really hot summer, probably the same summer, the black undercoat just bled through, resulting in this patterning. And at first, I really disliked it, but now I really like it a lot. And then one day I walked outside and found this lantern sitting out on the street. It's not old, but it provides a really lovely glow at night, and hang it on an iron shepherd's hook. Um, Outdoor furniture, it's an essential part of every garden, right? And the outdoor furniture in New York has to be really tough. So I found this wrought iron table and chairs at a junk shop in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, about 35 years ago. Turns out it's a fairly classic pattern, and boy, it's really heavy. And this furniture has survived the New York weather beautifully with just a couple of repaint jobs. The umbrella was being thrown out, and it just happened to fit perfectly into my table. So for the first time in my life, I had a table with an umbrella. And who doesn't dream of that? New York is not without its beautiful flowering trees, like these cherries in Central Park that I make a point of visiting every spring. But my dream was always to have some flowering trees of my own. I grew up under the oldest elm tree in Minneapolis, and I developed a deep relationship with it. I love trees, unless they're ailanthus trees. And I wanted to add some height around the perimeter of the garden. So this eastern dogwood, Cornus floridia, was the first tree that I planted. I guess it's about 30 years old now. It's an understory tree in the forest, like the Pacific dogwood out here in the Northwest. And when I planted it, the ailanthus trees were still there, still in place. But once those trees were removed, the new light intensity acted like a growth hormone on everything in the garden, really. And the dogwood just shot up several feet. It seemed like it happened almost overnight. In the spring, it's covered with these beautiful white flowers. It's a sight you don't often see in the city. This witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana, is a plant that I really treasure. I wanted a witch hazel for years because they're one of the earliest flowering shrubs, and they have these bright yellow, cheery flowers. Even when there's still snow on the ground, as there is here. It starts to flower in March before anything else. And I also love the scent of witch hazel. It fills the garden with this soft, somewhat astringent scent that has been likened to my personality. I also always wanted a lilac too, because I grew up next to a huge lilac hedge. And a few years ago, I found this Syringa persica, Persian lilac, at a plant stand at the Union Square Farmers Market and schlepped it home on the subway. It was much smaller then, of course. Now, I should mention here that finding garden plants in Manhattan has always been a really major challenge. But now, nurseries from throughout the area often set up stands at farmers markets, and they've become some of the best places to find new and interesting plants in Manhattan. Now, my lilac starts to flower in early May, and then I have that unmistakable scent of lilac in the middle of New York. Boy, I love that. I love that scent. This leatherleaf viburnum I also found down at the Union Square Farmers Market, lugged it home on the subway. I wanted something big and sturdy in the southeast corner of the garden, and this one certainly does the trick. It has never flowered, and I don't think it ever will. But I do like the large, coarse leaves. And you see this evergreen viburnum in parks all over New York because it is so hardy. Over the years, I've discovered that there are all kinds of dogwoods that are shrubs and they grow in the shade. And this is a yellow twigged dogwood that I put in a few years ago, Cornus sericea. It has these delicate white flowers in the spring and yellowish bark that adds interest in the winter. You probably recognize this hydrangea, Northwest gardeners. It's called Limelight, and it's my newest addition to the garden. I was looking for a shrub that would flower later in the summer. I really wanted an oak leaf hydrangea, but I couldn't find one. And when I finally did, it was so expensive I couldn't afford it. So I got this Limelight instead. This one has big, kind of showy flower clusters that turn greenish red in the fall. I enjoy the garden in all seasons, including winter. And the yew that you see in the lower right-hand corner of this photo um, is a plant that one or two people have suggested I might get rid of, but I refuse to do so because it has great sentimental value for me, because it was used as a prop in my very first play in New York. And when the show closed, I lugged the yew home and I planted it, and it's been there right outside my door ever since. Well, during New York winters, you can always expect snow. I love the way it cakes everything with this kind of white frosting. And then usually we have a blizzard or two or three or four. So sometimes I have to go outside with a broom and knock all that heavy snow off the branches so they don't crack off. But then spring comes and the garden starts stirring to life again. And by May, the whole garden is transformed. And I love that time of year. I love it there. I love it here. I love it everywhere. And I'm sure that you do too. It's just such a season of promise, isn't it? Now, over the years, I've filled in the garden with many plants that were given to me by friends from their gardens or from their property. I have several of these ostrich ferns, which have naturalized themselves in very shady spots throughout the garden. They're beautiful upright ferns. They grow to be about 2 feet tall, and they shoot up like green fountains, and they stay upright and green all summer long. Really a pretty, pretty fern. This is the only invasive plant that I decided to keep in the garden. And that's in large part because it's almost impossible. No, it is impossible to uproot. And believe me, I have tried. It's called Eve's necklace. And to this day, I don't know how Eve got her necklace up to the Upper West Side of Manhattan, because this is native to Texas and Oklahoma. But I do keep it severely cut back so it won't grow into a big tree. What's the first perennial plant you think of for shady areas where nothing else will grow? You said it, hostas, right? Hostas. Uh, I have this very shady area next to the back wall that I never quite knew what to do with. I tried several different things. I was never satisfied with any of them. I wanted something that had some color and some flair. You know how important flair is in the garden, right? And then a couple of years ago in Portland, I started noticing all these giant new hosta varieties with these fantastic leaf shapes and colors. So I brought a few of them back and I planted them, and they do wonderfully well back there by the wall. Hostas, Portland hostas in New York. And I particularly like this version called, yes, you guessed it, Blue Angel, because it's such an unusual color and the leaves are so showy. It looks like it's ready to start singing on Broadway, you know? Well, the perennial plants you can grow in a woodland or shade garden, they usually don't have a lot of color. the flowers tend to be kind of shy and pale and delicate. And that's why I really like primroses, because they provide this bright shot of pure color in the spring, early spring. And we have lots of them here in Portland, including candelabra primroses, but I never thought I could naturalize them in New York because of the severe winters. But one spring, I planted some that I'd had in a planter indoors, and one of them wintered over, and now it comes back every spring. A beautiful blue color. Got a lot of these geraniums. They're a graceful flowering perennial. I just let them grow wherever they want to grow. They flower typically in mid-June to July. Really beautiful little plant. The hosta flowers tend to be all variations on a theme. I think there's probably more interest in the leaves, the leaf shapes and colors. This Liriope spicatum is another plant that a friend gave me from his garden. It's very tough and hardy. It's grass-like, really, and it has this nice purple flower spike that comes up later in the summer. And a few years ago, I planted my very first dicentra, or bleeding heart. Oh, it's such a romantic old plant. I planted it near the old Christmas ferns, and it comes up every spring with these beautiful blossoms in May. Does very well. Well, surprise, surprise, I ran out of space in the soil. But once a gardener, always a gardener, I wanted to put some large plants in the alcove where there's absolutely no soil at all and even less light. So to do that, I needed some big pots, but I've learned that terracotta, beautiful as it may be, does not overwinter in New York. It just crumbles to pieces. So I managed to find this indestructible concrete pot decorated with river rock. And in it, I planted this river birch, which you can see to the left there, which, yes, I found at the Union Square Farmers Market. And the verdict's still out on how it will do over the long haul, but I do love having it there. And this Nantucket viburnum is right across from it, and it's doing very well in its big plastic pot. Now, I personally dislike plastic pots, but this one looks pretty good, and the viburnum certainly doesn't mind. You know, it has these lightly scented blossoms in May and June, and it's drought resistant, does very well in its big plastic pot. I can't bear to throw away living plants. Maybe you're the same way. I just can't. But when I began thinning out the two kinds of Solomon seal that were taking over the garden, I put them into two big old pots that I still had sitting around, and they just loved it. You know, they come up every spring, they flower, they stay green and upright all summer uh, with a minimum of watering. This is an idea you might consider in a shady area in your garden. Solomon seal in big pots. Well, I don't have time to elaborate on all the unique challenges that I faced as an urban gardener in Manhattan. The biggest one, besides finding plants, was the water challenge. When my initial source of water, siphoned off from the basement boiler, was cut off after several years because they installed a new boiler that didn't have a water spigot. How dare they? And that's why everything in the garden has to be drought resistant. Everything in my garden is what our former New York governor used to say, has to be New York tough. The plants get no water except for the rainfall, natural rainfall, and the only watering I do is in those big pots. So the clinging vines challenge, yes, that was all my fault, mea culpa. 40 years ago, I planted lots of bittersweet, Virginia creeper, more ivy, English ivy, Hedera helix. I just wanted to be surrounded by as much green as possible in gray old New York, you know? But I had no idea how destructive these vines could be or how fast they could grow. Well, these various vines shot over my wall. They climbed up 5 stories on the building next door, and they completely covered the back walls and all the windows. And it was beautiful. It was sensationally green. But one day I came home, and the landlord or someone next door had cut down all the vines, pulled them down, and tossed 5 stories worth over the wall into my garden. And that was one of the very few times when my neighbors heard me shout obscenities. So now I keep the vines on my side of the wall severely pruned, but the ivy and creepers on their side of the wall are taking over the building again. And this time they can't blame it on me. I hate mechanical noise, and I think you probably do too. And you see the that ominous looking thing on top of that building, which is on West End Avenue, and that I see from my garden. That is an enormous, and I mean enormous, exhaust fan. And I watched with horror and trepidation as they installed it. And when they finally turned it on, well, it was so loud. It was so loud. I was going to try to do an impersonation of it for you, but I figured it would terrify everyone and you'd run away from your computers. Anyway, it was so loud that I literally could not stand to be outside in the garden or inside my apartment for that matter. It threatened to completely ruin my life in New York and the lives of everyone who had back gardens or apartments. So I quickly went on the offensive, some might say the warpath, and I ran around the neighborhood with leaflets that I taped to doors, and I rang doorbells that no one answered. And finally, I managed to get a handful of neighbors to join me in, well, let's call it a semi peaceful protest to do something about this infernal noise. And finally, they installed these bizarre but thankfully effective noise reducers, and we can all once again hear the birds. This is looking down into the back gardens from just below that awful fan. And I won't tell you what I was doing up on that terrace, except that the initials are EPA. Now you see the area that's all concrete down there, that's right next to my garden. Well, about 45 years ago, that was a really lush garden. That was where one of the ailanthus trees grew. But the people who rented that apartment and had made that garden moved away. And then the apartment sat empty for about 35 years. I'm not kidding you. It's called warehousing. And when the landlord, who's my landlord, decided to gut the apartment and make a new one, they completely eradicated the old garden too. And they paved it over and they turned it into this lovely concrete griddle. And as they were doing this work, I noticed that the workmen were hauling out buckets of really rich soil from that old garden out to a dumpster in front. So I quickly got my step ladder and I peered over the wall and I said, "Hey, you know, you guys could save a lot of time and labor by simply throwing that really rich soil over my wall." "What?" they said. "Yes," I said. I'll work it into my garden." So they were happy to do it. Saved them a lot of time and a lot of labor, and boy, was that soil a wonderful addition to my garden. But then they put up uh, on their side um, this wall that rose up about 18 inches above my stucco wall, and it was made out of a dead looking product called fiber cement board, which led to the new wall challenge: how to turn that really ugly extension into something that I could bear to look at and that was halfway aesthetically pleasing. So finally, I painted the cement board the color of the stucco, and Gary made and painted and installed this green lattice that screens the extension. And I think it's a really effective solution, and it didn't cost a heck of a lot of money either. Well, folks, New York is skyscrapering itself to death. I hate to say it. These are some of the new needle towers or super talls that are destroying New York. Because the way of life that these things represent is completely divorced from any relationship to the city, the streets, people around them, and of course, to the earth itself. And that's why I personally prefer living the low life in New York. The life that lets me actually step outside and put my hands in the earth whenever I want to and watch the seasons unfold through my living room windows. I love the human sounds that I hear during the day. I hear a tenor singing opera arias that he's going to sing that evening at the Metropolitan Opera. And I hear a Broadway singer belting out show tunes. And she's sometimes surprised when I join in. And I hear professional musicians from the New York Philharmonic practicing on their pianos and their violins. Babies laughing, children playing, cutlery clanking at mealtimes. Sometimes, yes, sometimes violent altercations. It's New York. But I also love the garden at night when I can just step outside, light the lantern or not, and watch a couple of fireflies winking off and on in late June or early July. Never more than 2 or 3 that come to the garden. And I can enjoy the night scenes in my neighborhood, the lights that blink on in windows all around me, the light that rises up kind of mysteriously behind the other garden walls. And I can hear the sound of crickets in the summer, such a wonderful sound. And on warm days, and since I'm Scandinavia, that's every day that's 32 degrees and above, we tend to eat our meals outside or not, sit under the umbrella or not, read, enjoy the cooling breath and beauty of the garden. And in the midst of this great, noisy, striving, always changing city, I can step outside and enjoy something as simple and beautiful as the shadows that the plants cast on the stucco walls. And that concept of borrowed scenery in Japanese gardening? Well, really, it just means that you borrow from the larger landscape around you and you make it a visual part of your own garden. And 40 years ago, as I said, the gardens all around me were pretty derelict. People were terrified to even step foot outside. But over the years, most of these neighborhood gardens have been rediscovered and planted with trees and excuse me, giant bamboo, which you see here. And all of this is now my borrowed scenery, which simply means that there's absolutely nothing I can do about what's on the other side of my garden walls. E.M. Forster once said that every writer needs a room with a view, and I would expand that to every person needs a room with a view. But what Forster meant was that when you look up from your writing or your work, to take a break or to reflect or refocus, it really helps to have a calm view outside your window. And I feel very lucky indeed to have such a view from the room where I write in New York. The challenges that I faced while making this garden in Manhattan are nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing in comparison to the joys that I've experienced. This garden is deeply embedded in my heart and in my personal history. There is a bit of pain and sadness mixed in with the joy, though, because I know that this garden will not last very long once I vacate the premises. I think it will probably be turned into a concrete griddle like the one next door. But I knew from the very beginning that it was a rental garden, that I leased it, but I would never own it, and anything I put into it would one day vanish because I can never pass this garden on. And in that sense, this garden, like any garden really, has helped me to ground myself in the present and really derive enormous joy and pleasure from creating a small but ever changing landscape of beauty around me. I've always been an environmentalist, and creating a garden, no matter how small it may be, it's a way to encourage and communicate with nature, even in the midst of an enormous city like New York. If you plant a tree, a bird will come and sit in it and sing its song, as long as we have birds. And over the years, my Gotham garden has appeared in novels, and it's inspired plays and poems and paintings and certainly photographs. It's a sanctuary and it's an inspiration. And I always hope that it gives pleasure to the friends who visit and to the many, many people who can see it from their windows or their rooftops or their balconies. I can't pass it on, but I love sharing my Gotham garden, and I have really loved sharing it with you this evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Donald. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. I mean, you've taken what could have been just, a boring concrete patio like your neighbors, and you turned it into this beautiful lush garden that's really uniquely your own, but it's also very unique to New York with all of the tossed and found pieces that you've brought into that, which I just think really makes a garden special when you bring in all those
Well,
personal.
it really adds to the personality of a garden, and gardens do have personalities, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have someone just posted in the chat that he's now been gardening in Portland for the last couple of years, but these are so exactly the sweet memories of my own cloistered gardening refuge on 1/94th of an acre in Yorkville for 25 years. So he
Oh
says,
my
thank you.
goodness. And he's made the opposite trip from New York to
Yeah.
Portland.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Well, you've got a wonderful climate and place to garden here. So I hope that you can create a really lovely, lovely spot of your own here.
So do you have some sort of community of other urban gardeners in New York, or are you kind of on your own?
There is a community, and I haven't, frankly, tapped into it. There's also the Central Park Conservancy, which I think is a really important organization. And I want to actually try to establish some way. I would like to establish a group of gardeners in the city who can maybe visit one another's gardens and also share plants. Because as I said, I just hate to throw away living plants. And I know that somewhere in the city, someone could use them, plant them, enjoy them as much as I've enjoyed them. So that's something that's on my agenda to create in the coming year or two.
Oh yeah, it's a great idea. It's like Hardy Plant Society, and we have our
Correct.
member gardens open, and it's so much
Yes.
fun to see other people's gardens. So that's a really great idea.
Yeah.
I hope you're
It's a
able to
little
get.
it's a little bit more difficult in New York because you're in apartment buildings. So you're
Right.
sort of you're sort of buzzing people into your building, and through the hallway and into your apartment and through your apartment and back into the
Yeah,
garden and so on. So it's a little bit of a different experience. Yeah.
definitely. So we do have a few more questions from our audience too.
Sure.
Uh, Someone asks, what happens to your garden when you're in Portland? Does someone look after it?
Sometimes someone looks after it. I have a couple of really dear friends who, in the summer, take it upon themselves to help water those plants in the big pots. Everything else, it has to take care of itself. That's part of my philosophy. The
Hmm.
garden has to survive with just natural rainfall, and the only things that are watered are in those big pots. So it's one of those things that when I leave, I just have to sort of hope that when I come back, everything's going to be okay. Now, the walls tend to protect the garden. So when we have these, newish superstorms and so on, the wind isn't able, to come through and destroy things that are low to the ground. Some of the treetops can get a bit of wear and tear.
Mhm.
So it is protected in that way. And, you know, it is really kind of like a terrarium back there. It is a kind of protected environment. So, yes, as I said, I have a couple of very dear friends who help me out with the watering of those big plants. But otherwise, you're on your own, baby.
Yep, that's great. Leslie asks, has your New York garden inspired any of your neighbors to start digging into their own plots?
No, because well, I mean, I suppose they could if they could see over the wall and see what I've done back there. Um, but I haven't seen any faces peering over at me or into my garden. I would welcome them if they wanted to do that. No, I don't think my own garden has probably inspired any other gardens around me. But I have noticed in the past 5 years um, that more and more people have planted things back there. And that's mostly because I can hear them. And
Mm,
then when the plants start growing, for instance, the people behind me and over to one side planted this giant bamboo. Well, I couldn't believe it. It shot up. It's now about, I don't know, it's about 25 feet tall. Um, and other trees as well. So I can see those. Those are my borrowed scenery, as I said.
mhm.
And I really like the way those look. I think I enjoy them more than they can see anything and, you know, and find any inspiration in mine. But anyone's welcome. They can come and peer over the wall, and I'll even give them some plants.
Oh, that's great. Julianne wants to know if you're able to compost.
We cannot compost, Julianne, because of, oh, I hate to say it, rats. Rattus rattus.
Oh,
We have to be pretty careful about that. I have a bird feeder out there in back, and I do put bird seed in that. And I kind of worry that it's going to attract rodents. It hasn't so far, but you know, New York does have a problem. And in the latest flood during Ida, um, it was sort of like the Pied Piper without the Pied Piper. You know, there were rats running around in the city, not in my garden, thank goodness, and not on my street. But they are a reality, and we have to be aware of them. So anything that's compostable with, for instance, vegetable matter, no, can't do it.
mm,
So all I can do is get bags now. Now that things can be delivered, you see, this is the whole new world we live in. When I first moved to New York, nothing was delivered, but now I could even have bags of compost delivered, and I can work that into the garden. Compost that's already been sterilized and, you know, all of
mhm.
that, or bark mulch, but not any kind of. I wish I could uh, vegetable compost.
So I think we're probably all a little jealous of all of the amazing free objects you've found and collected because
Well, you
there's
know, you do have to overcome a certain middle class reticence about taking things from the street. But I have to say, if you live in New York, you will pass the most incredible objects, beautiful things being thrown out all the time because people are moving all the time. And some people have been in their apartments for, you know, decades, and they're moving out, and you know, their kids are throwing stuff on the street, and you know, beautiful pieces of furniture. So everything that I have found for the garden has basically been, you know, on the street or from a junk shop or something like that. And actually, I enjoy that. I think that that also adds to the personality of a garden. Um,
definitely.
you know, a garden isn't, you know, about a new room necessarily. It's about something that should look worn and, you know, lived in and, you know, worked in and all that sort of stuff. So I can't, I have no room for anything more. I can't fit anything else in the garden, but I've been very lucky over the years to find some really nice objects, I think, to put out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Mary Ellen is wondering if you have any more good dumpster diving stories.
Do I have any other good dumpster diving stories? The best diving stories were the architectural fragments along West End Avenue
Yeah.
because I couldn't believe that these beautiful pieces of work, um, which helped so much to beautify the buildings, were just being hacked off and thrown away. And that's really why I began to collect those. And I have a collection. I didn't show all of them, but I have, a lot of those embedded here and there in the garden. But that's probably my best dumpster dive.
That's great. Found some good stuff.
And hi, Mary Ellen.
Anne C. Anne is wondering if you have rent control.
No, but I have rent stabilization. Rent control was the earliest form of protecting tenants. It was instituted right after World War II. And what it meant originally was that your rent could never be changed. I mean, you could live in a place for 20 years and it could have 5 bedrooms and you could be paying $80 a month. That's an exaggeration. Rent stabilization was the next aspect of that. And what rent stabilization means is that, excuse me, your rent can be increased only by an amount that's set by a regulatory board when you sign your lease. So it used to be every 3 years, you could sign a lease for 3 years. You can't do that anymore. You could sign a lease for 1 or 2 years. And then every time you sign that new lease, there's going to be a different rate for if you sign for a 1-year lease or if you sign for a 2-year lease. And under our current mayor, Bill de Blasio, the only good thing I can say about our current mayor is that he's kept the rent increases for rent stabilized apartments very low, like at 1 or 2%. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So Portland has lots of little nurseries and plant shops all over the city. You said that New York, you get a lot of your plants at farmers markets. Are there nurseries around the city as well, or places you can buy plants?
No, not well. When I first moved to New York, there were a couple of, I don't know if I'd call them nurseries. I guess I'd call them nurseries. They were way downtown. They were exorbitantly expensive and they didn't have much selection. And so, if you're a gardener, you're always looking for, some new kind of plant that you want to add to your garden. And that's been the problem. That's why the nurseries that are in the surrounding metropolitan area, many from New Jersey or Long Island, now come in with stock, sometimes really interesting plants that I would never be able to find elsewhere. And they set up stands in the various farmers markets. The best one is the Union Square Farmers Market downtown, which happens to be right on the subway line too, which makes it a little bit easier. Although I do get some stares when I come on the train with my big plants. But there are nurseries if you have a car and you can, drive out to surrounding areas. But right in the city, no, it's really quite difficult.
Okay. Let's see. So what advice do you have for someone who's just getting started with urban gardening and is a little unsure where to start with a really small plot like you might have?
Well, as you saw, my plot is really very small, it's 340 square feet. You have to look at your garden carefully, or at your possible garden carefully. You have to look at the light intensity. You have to determine what will grow. Not everything will grow in every urban garden. You have to make allowances for shade or for direct sunlight or whatever it may be. And that's certainly going to determine what you put into your garden. I think that there are such experts at the Portland nurseries that they are a fantastic source of information and help. You can always ask them and they usually know what they're talking about and they can usually help you find plants that you would like. Pay attention to the soil. And if you just have a patio, you can do incredible things with pots. You do have to be careful about the water dripping down onto your neighbor below, if you're on a high floor, and watering and all of that sort of thing. But gardening is, so much of it is instinctual, Figure out the plants that you really like. Read a couple of books, like for instance, years ago, I used to read books on shade gardening. It just helped me find or to learn about plants that would do well in shady conditions. Those plants, those are going to be very different from any kind of a garden that has direct sunlight for several hours a day. You can have a totally different kind of garden with very different flowers and perennials with more sunlight. So pay attention to the garden, pay attention to the light, ascertain what kind of soil you have, and don't be afraid to grow plants in big pots. You will be surprised at what you can grow in a big pot. I mean, those Solomon seal that I put in were a real surprise for me, and also that river birch. They're all, and the Nantucket viburnum, they're all doing very well in pots. And typically those are always plants that you see in the soil. So just pay attention, decide what you like, visit nurseries, browse nurseries like you would browse a bookstore. We used to browse bookstores. Just look around, see the plants that you like, and then just start working from there.
That's great. Yeah, I think a lot of people are moving to a lot smaller places, and so
They
urban
are.
gardening is just a lot more popular, and it's the way it's going to be
It's the
going forward
way,
for a lot
yes,
of people.
it's the way it's going to be. And believe me, you will be so happy creating your urban garden. It will give you such pleasure, even if it's like three plants in big pots. It just allows you to communicate with nature a little bit. And that, in this day and age, is more important than ever. We really need to protect the earth as much as we can, and we need to encourage people to plant trees and to have gardens and to reduce some of the stress that we live with in this world of ours. It's never been so stressful as it is now.
Mhm, mhm.
It's been shown that just walking through a garden or a park or a forest will reduce stress, make you feel healthier. So gardening is really important, and I love it. That's why I wrote my gardening books, my garden tour books. I want people to discover the joys, the pleasures, the beauty, the history of gardens, and I hope that they will do that and just enjoy them because they are so beautiful and they are such they're gifts from nature. So go with the flow, baby, and make your garden grow.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. That's a great way to, I think, end the night as well. I think we wrapped up with questions and with a really inspirational way to end things. So
Well, good night, everyone, and thank
yeah,
you so much for asking me to be here tonight. I have really enjoyed it, and I hope you have too.
thank you. We all appreciate having you here as well. So have a great evening, everyone, and I will send out the link to the recording soon as well.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye bye.